Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Homeland, the series where we discuss and celebrate all things Israel. I'm so honored today to be speaking to Ambassador Taub directly in Yerushalayim. How are you, Ambassador Taub?
Hi, Rabbi Yoni. It's wonderful to be with you. Really, I'm wonderful to be connected with St. John's Wood. I have to say, we have such warm memories. You know, my kids remember Diane throwing chocolates across the shul at the end. I don't know if you can do that in COVID anymore. The excitement of the children, kiddies, and all together, just such wonderful, warm people. Here in Israel, we have a lot to celebrate. We just had a lovely Shavuot, but as you know, the situation is very complicated with a lot of things that are happening at the same time. You know, on the one hand, you know, we're still coming out of COVID. It's still, you know, there's still a lot of sensitivity. There's still a shadow and so on, even though, thank goodness, we're in a good situation. And then, of course, we have a combination of security challenges at the moment. We have in Jerusalem and a number of other mixed Arab Jewish cities, a lot of unrest, which has been very difficult and is really rolling back coexistent efforts, you know, quite a significant way. And then, as I know so many of you have been following over the last week, 8 days, we've seen Hamas starting another round of missile attacks, which have been very, very difficult. And all of this, of course, is happening in a situation of political instability. We have no government really to speak of at the moment. We're supposed to be having elections for the president that are supposed to be happening any day. So we have a background of instability. If you ask me personally, it obviously affects the work that I do, which is working with foundations, trying to support the weaker populations in Israel. And on a personal level, 2 of my children and my son-in-law have been called up to reserve duty because of the security situation. So that's, of course, a concern. And until they come home safe and sound, you know, we have an extra level of concern. But it's wonderful to hear feelings of concern and warmth from Jews all around the world. You know, you really do feel a sense of unity within Israel. We see wonderful efforts to help the weaker members of society. There's amazing volunteer efforts, non-profit organizations that are doing an incredible thing. So there are points of light, and please God, we've been through things before and we'll come out on the far side.
Well, it's really wonderful to have this opportunity to chat to you. And, you know, you still have a seat in St. John's Wood Synagogue. We've now got an ambassador's seat in the Ezrat Nashim as well for Ambassador Hotelevi. But I'm curious to understand, perhaps you could share with us a little bit of context, because as you say, the situation globally is frightening. Just this past Sunday, we had in St. John's Wood, it made the national press. There was a huge amount of convoys of Palestinian-driven cars with flags and sirens and shouting anti-Jewish abuse. And I guess really, from my perspective as a community rabbi in St. John's Wood, where we've got tons of members who are very worried about this, what's the message that you want to share with them from Israel? What's our job? What do we need to be doing?
So I think the first thing that I would say to you and to any parent in St. John's Wood who's worried about themselves and worried about their children as well and what they're being exposed to is your first responsibility is to look after yourselves. Really, and looking after yourselves means a number of things. First of all, it obviously needs to make sure that the community is safe. And actually, the British Jewish community is blessed with probably the leading community security organization in the world, with extraordinary relationships with government and so on. But to make sure that everybody feels safe, it's very important. And then the second thing is to make your children have positive relationships with Judaism and with Israel. I think there really is a challenge that we will raise a generation who associate going to shul with having to go through security measures, who associate Israel with having to defend it on campus, having to defend it against all sorts of sort of mindless fake news and so on. And I feel one of the challenges is to raise a generation that has positive associations, a positive relationship with Israel. And I think that's something that really, you know, it's when I used to go to visit Jewish schools sometimes in the UK, and I said, what do you do about Israel education? And sometimes they would say to me with pride, well, we have an Israel advocacy course for our lower sixth form or something. And I would say to them, if you have only an hour a week to teach your kids about Israel, do me a favor, don't teach advocacy. Teach the reasons to be proud for Israel. Teach them, you know, things that will be actually nurture a lasting relationship, you know, because that will be sustainable. And so that is, I think, one of the messages in all of this. And by the way, I think that is probably the most powerful argument we have against these fierce critics of Israel. When I used to go to a university and see some of these, I suppose some of them are the same people who were driving through St. John's Wood, but these demonstrators outside trying to stop me speak. And it was a very strange group of people. It was a combination of extreme Islamists and radical leftists, what sometimes people call the Red-Green Alliance. And if you think about it, it's a really odd combination. And you can break it up very easily. You just have to say to them, I know what it is that you're standing against, but tell me what it is you stand for. Are you in favor of women's rights? Are you in favor of freedom of expression? And so on. And that coalition just falls apart. And I think the strength that we have is that we have a positive vision, that we can stand up for something. And so I think one of the challenges at this time is to make sure that we are voicing a positive vision and one that we can pass on to our children.
Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about that positivity, because there's so much positive stuff to talk about. You're, of course, the ambassador from 2011, 2015. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that experience. What was it like? What was your highlights? And you look back at that time, I know you had incredible achievements making links between England and Israel in terms of industry and technology. But share with us a little bit, like, what was that like for you?
So first, it was an extraordinary period. I have to say, we were able to do some incredible things, but largely because we had incredible support, including from the British Jewish community, which is characterized by so much chesed. I have to say, sometimes we wish there was a little bit less chesed, because there was a dinner every night that we had to go to raising money for something, some important charity, but absolutely wonderful, and support for Israel so deep. And it was a wonderful period to be there. We had a government that was so supportive of Israel, so keen to develop the business ties, to develop the intelligence ties, and so on and so forth. So that was really, really wonderful. I would say when I look back, beyond the St. John's Wood Kiddishes, which are obviously the absolute highlight of my time in London, but coming close after that, visits to the royal family and so on. But I would say for me, the things that gave me the greatest satisfaction were building bridges with parts of the communities or parts of Britain that hadn't really had a connection with Israel before, because there you really felt that you were breaking new ground. So I have to say, part of it was in the Jewish community. I spent some time with the Haredi community that hadn't traditionally had a relationship with either Israel or the Israeli embassy, I would say. So in Gateshead and Stamford Hill, and it felt, a little bit like doing something new. But within Britain, it was wonderful to go to places or to be involved in new areas. And I found one of the tricks, if you like, that made it very, very much easier was to find partners and to do these things together. So just one example, the first year I was in the UK, Hanukkah was coming, and I was very friendly with the Greek ambassador. So I said to him, look, we have this festival coming up, and it really marks the relationship between ancient Greece and ancient Jewish civilization. I fudged it a little bit, but anyway, I said, let's do an event for the leaders of the Greek community and the leaders of the Israeli and Jewish communities, and bring historians and discuss what was going on. And it was just wonderful. It opened up a new world to us. The same thing we did with the Spanish when we had joint iftar. Iftar fell on Asara B'Tevet, on Ramadan. So we did a joint iftar event. It's it turns out, that the Muslim fast goes out a little bit before our fast goes out. So it's the only place I've ever been that non-Jews were eating and the Jews weren't eating. It's not the normal course of events, but actually looking for common ground, trying to find those abilities with the partner. I think for me, where you feel you've made a new relationship, a new friendship, those are some of the most special things.
This particular series of interviews is directed to everyone across the community to try and give a little bit of clarity of what's going on, especially to younger members of the community. I want to share with you an image that I received today from a younger member of the community who asked me, Rabbi, how would you respond to this on social media? And I thought, you know what, it's a great question. I'm going to ask Ambassador Taub later on. This was the image that he sent to me. And it's these type of images and so many more that people are seeing on social media, whether it be propaganda or anti-Israel sentiment, What would you tell an 18-year-old, 19-year-old on university campus in response to this image? Al rega achat.
Sure. So I would start with a simple principle, which is that you cannot expect to have a soundbite to answer every falsehood if you don't have the education to back it up. The fact is, this is a vicious falsehood. The fact is, there never was a Palestinian state in the whole of Israel. And every time a Palestinian state has been offered, it's been rejected not by Israel, but by the Palestinian side, starting from the partition resolution in 1947. So it's a genuine fiction. I don't want to spend all of our time going on the history of it if we want to do a briefing about the history of Israel. But one of the things that I would say to young people, the first thing I said, which I still stand by, is I said, you want to make sure your relationship with Israel is positive. You want to make sure that it's nourished by your passion. If you care about, I don't know what, about technology, make that your bridge to Israel. If you care about films and music, make that your bridge to Israel. But have a relationship with Israel that speaks to you. But I think there's something else, which is that if you're going to care about Israel and you're going to be in current society, you need to educate yourself. And you can't do that if your knowledge of Israel is based on things that you learned, the last time when you were around your bar mitzvah. And one of the things that I suggest to young Jewish people, particularly people who are going off to university or college, try every semester, every term, to read one book about Israel. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be, if you want to know how to defend Israel, you can read Alan Dershowitz. If you want to know about Israeli humor, read Edgar Keret, who writes very funny stories. Whatever it is, but literally at the time that your mind is maturing in every other way, you owe it to yourself to make sure that your relationship with Israel matures as well. You don't want to be somebody who is an adult, and yet when it comes back to Israel, what you remember is from Cheder. And so, it could be, Rabbi Yoni, and I'm happy to help, that you can help with a list of suggested books. Something else I've suggested, maybe somebody who's in the community would be kind enough to sponsor for young people going off to campus a small library of books that they could choose and take with them to campus and read, and maybe they could have a discussion bit about it. But the fact is, if it's a relationship, you need to nurture it. Your mind is growing, and you should feed it on Israel as much as you feed it on everyone else, on everything else.
Absolutely. That's sound advice. I think the challenge is often our young professionals or students might suddenly have an interest when there's a flare-up in terror, and they suddenly want to know, what do I respond? But it's not just about that. It's about knowing.
Also, I would say one thing about that as well. You're not alone, and you shouldn't be alone. Thank goodness there are in the community people who are there to help you. And if you feel yourself in a situation where either you personally, feel under attack or disadvantaged, or you feel that Israel is not getting a fair break, then if you're a student, then definitely you should be approaching UJS, or if it's elsewhere, you should be approaching the Board of Deputies, or if it's a legal issue, you have the UK Lawyers Friends of Israel, and so on and so forth, and obviously the Israeli Embassy, and you should reach out, and you should not be embarrassed. These are people who have been through things that are similar to what you're going at the moment, and these are things that need to be faced together. And I'll tell you one other thing: if you find yourself in a debate, the first thing I would say is, you need to ask yourself the question, is this somebody who is capable of changing their mind? If it's somebody who is not capable of changing their mind, sometimes you have students who it seems were deliberately sent onto a particular campus with a particular agenda. It's the same thing, by the way, with diplomats. There's a famous saying amongst diplomats, you can change my opinion, but you can't change my instructions. So if you find yourself with somebody like that, then don't waste your time. But if you find that this is somebody who is open, that you can engage in a dialogue with, then genuinely engage in a dialogue. Say to me, why don't you give me an article that you think best expresses your opinion? I'll give you an article that best expresses mine, and we'll have a discussion about it. You can think about how you open up channels of communication. And I would say, by the way, for a young person engaging in these debates, the best single answer I know to a difficult question, to an accusation that you don't know whether it's true or not, but is very hurtful, is simply to say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. And then to take the effort of actually making a phone call, sending an email to the embassy, to BICOM or whatever, and getting back with the best information you have.
Sound advice. Sound advice. You know, looking through your incredible CV, you started off in haberdashers, you went to Oxford and Harvard, and you've had the most illustrious career, beginning off as a, you know, I think you were a combat medic in the IDF, and then you were the speechwriter for Chaim Herzog, and then you had your time in England, and now you're doing your stuff with Yad Hanadiv. Tell me, what's been your highlight of your incredible career? Other than this interview today, obviously.
I have to tell you, and I think a lot of people will identify. First of all, I've been very fortunate. I've had a lot of people that have helped me along the way, and I'm surrounded by people who have done, you know, more incredible things. Particularly now that I'm working in the field of social organizations, I meet people who are so purposeful and had such an extraordinary positive change in the world. But I think you'll find that almost anybody you speak to, the things that inspire them most are to see the next generation doing stuff that gives them pride. A couple of weeks ago, my oldest grandson, 6 years old, sang Anim Zmirot for the first time. And you know what? You know, there's very little. It doesn't matter which halls of power you walk in, which reminds me, by the way, my youngest son sang Anim Zmirot in St. John's Wood when he was probably about 11 years old at the time. And I have to say, one of the moments that was very joyful for me was to see one of my security guards with tears in his eyes when he saw young Amichai standing up on the bimah singing. So that was a special moment.
Brilliant. Well, Ambassador Taub, thank you so much for your time. It's so nice to see you, and we look forward to welcoming you in person to one of our Kiddushim in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Rabbi Yoni, and very, very warm wishes and love to all the Kehillah. Have a good evening.